I was the only one who cared for my dying father for years. When he passed, he left my sister a 9 to 50K house. I got the old lake house. My sister laughed, "Guess you were the worst daughter." But when I stepped inside that house, what I found... If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. If I failed today, I'd lose the only place I might afford to call home, and whatever was left of my pride. 3 days after the funeral, the lawyer's conference room smelled like coffee and dry paper, and I kept flexing my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. When the will was read, Paige exhaled like she'd just won a silent auction. "To my daughter Paige," the attorney said, "I leave my residence at 4521 Willow Drive." I already knew the number. I'd programmed the thermostat myself when Dad forgot how to set it. "To my daughter May," the voice went on, smooth as a brochure, "I leave the lake property on Lakeshore Road." Paige's smile didn't reach her eyes. The smile was for the room, not for me. "Well," she said afterward at the elevator, "guess the market knows who did the real work." She adjusted her expensive bag, the one that flashed like a badge of rank. I could list 100 medical supply receipts that said otherwise, but I didn't. I'd learned that arguing with her was like punching fog, tiring and pointless. The drive out took 47 minutes on muscle memory. My car's check engine light had glowed since January. I patted the dash the way you soothe a nervous dog. The road to the lake should have looked forgotten, but the gravel was tamped, the ditch cleared, the little green 911 sign straight. The house itself hunched under tall pines, shingles curled like brittle thumbnails, porch rail sagging as if it had been leaning on someone who'd stopped showing up. I fished the key from the envelope the lawyer had given me. Cold brass. The lock turned with a clean click that said someone had oiled it recently. "Here goes," I said to no one, and pushed in. The scent that met me wasn't the sour breath of a shut-up place. Lemon oil and coffee. Floorboards shone. A knitted throw was folded with hospital corner precision over the sofa arm, and a mug on the counter wore a ring of coffee, half an hour old. My muscles tightened down my back in a slow chain. "Hello." My voice landed and stayed, not echoing. The house felt occupied. Silence isn't empty if you can feel someone else's breath in it. I took in the bookshelf. Mysteries, a few romances, paperbacks with creased spines, and a TV mounted above a stone fireplace someone had scrubbed recently. This wasn't a forgotten camp. This was a home with warm dishes and a grocery list. I heard footsteps in the kitchen, deliberate and unhurried. My first thought was to back out and dial 911 from the porch, but my hand went to a framed photo on the mantel instead. Dad, Ray, had his arm around a woman with short silver hair and eyes like summer sky over deep water. He looked younger than he had in years. He looked unburdened. The footsteps paused. A soft humming resumed, a tune nobody sings in a hurry. I slipped the photo into my tote before I could decide whether that was petty or protective, and walked into the kitchen. She stood at the sink, sleeves pushed to her elbows, humming while the faucet rinsed out a drip coffee maker. Up close, she was the kind of beautiful that comes from not hurrying to impress anyone. No apology in the way she held herself. She turned when she sensed me, and for a heartbeat, we just looked. Her blue was sharper than in the photo. "You must be May," she said, drying her hands with a towel embroidered with tiny ducks. "I'm Nora." Nora Wells. The space between my shoulder blades unclenched and then tightened again. "You've been expecting me?" "I have." She hung the towel, straightened it. "He said you'd come today." "He?" I asked, though I knew. She didn't flinch. "Your father." I pulled out a chair and sat because my knees wanted a plan. "Then you can explain why my house has someone else's coffee in it." "Actually," she said, her voice gentle without being soft, "the property is yours. The house is in a living trust. He set it up 3 years ago." Heat moved up my neck. "A trust that belongs to..." She crossed to a drawer, pulled out a manila folder, and laid it on the table like a hand of cards. To the clear water. She stopped herself and smiled at her own correction. To the Lakeshore Trust. I'm the beneficiary. You're telling me I inherited the dirt, I said, but not the building. Essentially, yes. I sat very still so I wouldn't break anything within reach. A little crackling started in my ears. Outside, a loon called across the lake like someone whistling on a bone flute, and the sound steadied me. And you're living here because he asked me to, she said simply. 7 years, I guessed, and her eyebrows lifted in a flicker that told me I'd scored a point I didn't want. I cared for him here when he needed rest, she said. I cared for this place when he couldn't. I kept my distance when you were with him in town. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I could have argued vows and lines and the complicated arithmetic of grief, but what came out was smaller and truer. I'm so tired. The words surprised me. My hands remembered his walker, the night alarms, the slow spoonfuls of soup, my sister's silence, the pharmacy clerk who'd learned my name. I blinked hard. Nora slid a mug toward me. Sit, she said. Drink. She didn't touch me. I was grateful for that. The coffee tasted like something made with intention. When I set the mug down, she opened the folder and took out 2 envelopes, heavy stock, my name on one in Dad's careful hand, pages on the other. He wrote letters, Nora said. For both of you. He asked me to deliver them after the will. I turned mine over. The loop of the P in Parker made my chest ache. I broke the seal, and his voice rose off the page, neat as ledger lines. My dearest May, if you have this, then I didn't tell you what I should have when I could have. I read on, swallowing hard. He explained what the lawyer hadn't. He'd faced foreclosure when the medical bills ate the calendar. He'd made a deal to keep himself afloat, to keep me from seeing him sink. He'd set up the trust so the house would be protected, and someone he trusted, Nora, would keep it standing. He had done it quietly because the quiet felt easier than the truth. It hurt anyway. Paige, he wrote, had bought the Willow Drive place years earlier, downplaying market value when she controlled his paperwork. I don't want a war, he wrote. I want you safe. My mouth went dry. Safe from what? From who I'd become in service to duty? From my sister's competence honed into something harder? There was more. There was always more. In grief and in legal files. He'd buried a note in the letter like a seed. In 1987, when he'd repaired a closet floorboard, he'd found the first evidence of a pre-contact settlement. Pottery shards glittering like dulled stars, tools, a cache of beadwork, something carved with river spirals. He'd photographed everything, mapped coordinates, documented like a man who respected what he didn't own. He'd kept it quiet to protect the site and to protect us from what money does to families. My throat closed. He found something, I said, and Nora nodded, eyes bright with a feeling I couldn't name. In the bedroom closet, she said. He told me where. He wanted you to decide. I carried the letter with both hands as if it could bruise and walked down the hall. The closet still held his smell under the cedar, aftershave and a little machine oil. In the back corner, a board lifted with the knife of my fingernails. Beneath, a metal box waited, tape yellowed like old teeth. I set it on the bed and peeled back time. Photos, meticulously labeled, a journal in his tidy print, receipts for tarps and brushes and film. In the pictures, the earth opened like a whisper, and inside the whisper were patterns that matched ones I'd seen behind glass in museums when my son was little and obsessed with arrowheads. Except this wasn't a glass case. This was the ground under my feet. Good God, Dad, I said aloud. It came out almost a laugh and immediately turned into something else. Nora stood in the doorway, arms folded, not interrupting. He reached out to the State Heritage Commission 2 months before he passed, she said. He wanted a survey done right. He left a name, Dr. Kara Benton. There's a number on the last page. I found it. A business card taped beside a note in black ink with a date next to it, 2 days from now. My name in the margin. My stomach dropped and then rose like I'd hit a warm pocket of air on a long flight. I sat on the bed with the journal open across my knees and read the last entry again. I won't cash this in. It isn't mine to cash. But the land is ours, and it owes May a future. Coordinate with Dr. Benton. Let her do it right. The finder's fee and easement will see you through. Something steadied in me. A beam swung back into place. I'd come up here to assess a loss. Now I could see the outline of something that wasn't loss at all. It wasn't just value. It was responsibility. Heavy as a sleeping child and just as worth carrying. My phone buzzed. A text from Paige. Enjoy your shack. Maybe you can rent canoe spots in summer. LOL. I let the message sit. She thinks this place is a punchline, I said. I think it's a library. And a ledger, Nora said. Both matter. Kinetic beat broke the air. A car rolling up the drive, gravel pinging under the chassis. I went to the front window. Not Paige's white car, delivery. The driver hopped out, carried a box to the porch, and left. I opened it to find a stack of mail the post office had held during the funeral. Condolence cards, a bill from the oxygen company, a refund check from an overpayment for a hospital bed. The practical world jostled the sacred, as it always does. Back at the kitchen table, I spread Dad's photos like a playing field. If I call this Dr. Benton, I said, I changed the shape of my life. You already changed it, Nora said. You came here. I poured more coffee and let the steam kiss my face. The house felt different now, like standing backstage before a curtain goes up. Tell me everything, I said. 7 years, she said, not defensively. We met at the bait shop. He was buying nails and a coffee. I was complaining about the way men leave hooks on counter edges. He laughed. He told me the lake saved him once when the bills got mean. I told him I understood mean bills. He asked me what I cooked for breakfast. I said biscuits and ham if someone else did the dishes. He said he'd do them. I rubbed my thumb along a photo's edge. I was with him in town most days. He didn't tell me. He didn't know how, she said. He was ashamed of being a man with needs that weren't on the appointment list. So he asked you to keep the house, I said. And the secret. He asked me to keep it standing, she said, and a note of steel threaded her voice. He didn't ask me to be small. I looked up. I don't want you to be small. Good, she said, and her smile was quick and warm. Another kinetic beat. My phone rang. Paige's ringtone. 3 bright notes I regretted assigning. I let it buzz to voicemail and set the phone face down. My body remembered 1,000 little concessions I'd made to keep peace with her, and I felt each one like a splinter I could finally pull. I made myself read the letter again, slower. Dad had written about the house deal in plain terms. The papers Paige filed when she held his power of attorney. The difference between market value and what she said we could get away with. His decision to let it stand because he needed someone to pay for the medicine and because he didn't think I had room in my life for more battles. His shame bled through the loops and slants of his pen. Shame for letting his daughters carry what he should have. I set the letter down and stared at the trust papers until the words stopped writhing. I get the dirt, I said. You get the structure. We both get the truth, Nora said. And the truth is, he wanted you protected. The reversal hit me like a change in weather. Until this minute, I'd been planning to sell whatever I could and use the rest like sandbags against the year ahead. Now the plan swung. I saw the site as a hinge. If we opened it right, we'd turn years of scraping into a hallway I could walk without hunching. I need a new to-do list, I said, and Nora grinned. Coffee, call, closet, file, she said, in that order. I finished the coffee and called the number on the card. A recorded voice offered options. I pressed 2 for fieldwork, left my name, spelled it carefully, and said the words that changed the shape of my next week. I'm the landowner at the Lakeshore Road site. I have documentation. I'm ready to coordinate. I hung up and leaned my forehead to the cool glass of the window. On the lake, a pair of kayaks slid into view, paddles stroking like metronomes. The world kept moving. For once, I wasn't running to catch it. "Stay," I said to Nora, surprising myself. "I don't want to read the rest of this alone." "Okay," she said, as if we'd been practicing for this when we didn't know it. We went through the box until the sun made a gold stripe on the floor. Dad's journal wasn't just notes on objects. It was a record of restraint. Times he'd walked away from a promising patch because it abutted a burial ridge and he refused to disturb it. Names of tribal representatives he'd tried to call and then, finding none to answer, had left messages he never pressed. "You don't own the past," he'd written once in the margin. "You share it." The power flickered just once, old lines in windy trees, then steadied. I made a note to call the utility about the sagging service drop, proof that even on the day you change your life, you also have to schedule a bucket truck. Tangible problems kept the float of relief from turning me foolish. I had a savings account with 3 digits and a car that coughed in cold weather. The pharmacy had my card number memorized in a way that felt intimate and invasive. Yet now I also had coordinates and a name, and the mind of a woman who had just shifted from survival to stewardship. The difference tasted like clean water. I took the second envelope, the one addressed to Paige, and laid it on the table. "Do I give this to her?" I asked, "or let the lawyer do it?" "Depends who you want to be tomorrow," Nora said. I pictured Paige's face at the elevator. I pictured the way she'd learned to make me doubt my own measurements. If I failed today, I'd go back to being the woman who apologized when standing still. I slid the envelope into a new folder and wrote in my own hand a list. Call SHC, left message, photograph box contents, back up to thumb drive, replace closet board, leave no trace, ask Nora for spare key copy, update locks, change deadbolts, check taxes due, call county, do not answer Paige until I'm ready. I looked up at Nora. "Can you be here tomorrow at 10 if the commission calls back?" "I'll be here," she said, "with biscuits." I smiled in spite of everything. The house lightened, just a shade. I felt Dad nearby the way you feel heat off a wood stove after the flame is gone. Stored, radiating. Before we closed the box, I took one photo out and held it to the kitchen light. The shard in the picture had a pattern of river curves and tiny dots that reminded me of constellations. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt my lungs fill all the way to the top. By the time I left, dusk had folded itself into the pines. On the porch, I wrote a short message to Paige that was neither apology nor invitation. Busy today. Will connect when I have availability. M. I stared at the period at the end and let its weight be my own. I locked the door, the house door that was hers, the land steps that were mine, and tucked Dad's journal under my arm like the beginning of a new book. The drive back felt shorter. The check engine light still burned, but I didn't, for once, feel like I was about to break down on the shoulder. In town, my apartment smelled like laundry and lemon cleaner. I laid the journal on the table, turned off my phone, and let sleep come like tide. Tomorrow I'd talk to the state, return the closet to what it had been, and start the paper trail that would keep the site safe from greed, including my own. Tonight, I let my father's handwriting sit in the dark and keep watch. By 10 the next morning, the drive rattled with trucks and boots and the particular clatter of people who show up ready to measure the world into squares. The first kinetic note was the snap of a tape line in cool air, followed by the hollow thunk of a clipboard against a truck bed. A woman stepped out in a windbreaker with the State Heritage Commission crest on the chest and a sun-faded baseball cap. She had the unbothered posture of someone at home outdoors. I knew it was Dr. Kara Benton before she was close enough to introduce herself. Dad's neat script had left me expecting a straight spine and eyes that registered 100 tiny details before you said hello. "May?" she said, offering her hand. Warm grip, quick smile. "I'm Kara." Thank you for calling." Beside her, two field techs unloaded a bundle that looked like a sled made of PVC and wire. "Ground-penetrating radar," she said when I glanced at it. "We call it GPR because acronyms are shorter than breath." She winked as if to acknowledge she'd used up one of my daily allotment of capital letters. "Noise level, okay?" I asked, jerking my chin toward the house. Nora had a window open and a pan warming on the stove. Biscuits. She'd promised. "We'll be polite about it," Kara said. "We'll start with a walkover, establish a grid, then push a few lanes to see if we're looking at anything interesting before we commit to more gear. No disturbance to the soil today, just looking. Just looking. Just..." The most beautiful phrase I'd heard in months. She handed me a permission form that laid out in 6 paragraphs what just looking meant under state rules, where they could walk, what they could record, what they couldn't do without further written consent. I read every line, slower than my nerves wanted, and initialed with a calm hand that didn't feel entirely like mine. In the margin I wrote, "Landowner May Parker structure, held in separate trust, contact Nora Wells." It felt like declaring boundaries with ink. A breeze combed the lake, lifting little cat's paws against the surface. The pines talked to each other in needle whispers. The techs, Ty and Aaliyah, shouldered flags and twine, and a handful of bright pin flags that would turn the field into a dotted matrix. "Where do you want to begin?" Kara asked. I pointed to the gentle swell beyond the porch, where the ground rose and then dipped, as if it remembered a river that had changed its mind. "Dad wrote about anomalies toward the ridge," I said. He avoided the northern face, said the soil there had a feel he wouldn't disturb. Kara's head tipped in a small nod of respect. "We'll give that a wide berth." We started at the southwest corner of the clearing. Ty measured the baseline with a tape as long as a borrowed day and called numbers out with the sing-song that comes from saying them 1,000 times. Aaliyah tied bright string between stakes and turned the field into rectangles, one after another, measured in meters that converted in my head to feet without permission. Because I'd stocked shelves and mopped floors and made grocery lists in a country that liked to keep its math to itself. Every time they drove a stake, the sound went through my shoes. The body knows a promise when it hears one, even if the language is wood and soil. Nora came out with a plate balanced on one hand. "Breakfast diplomacy," she said. "Southern rules apply." "Biscuits?" Ty asked, suddenly half a boy. "Hot," Nora said. "Butter's inside." They took one each and set them on the truck tailgate like an altar to fieldwork. I watched Nora watch the grid. The care in her face wasn't pious or possessive. It was practical. She wanted the people with flags to see the house as a member of the family and the field as the yard that had always listened to it breathe. Kara gestured to the ridgeline. "We'll keep 20 feet off your tree trunks to avoid root damage," she said. "We'll run the radar sled in east-west lanes first, then north-south. If we see something, we'll slow down." "We're not moving dirt today," I said, half to myself. "No," she said, "we're reading it." We walked the first line together. The sled made a soft shushing noise over the grass, like someone turning a page. On the laptop strapped to the rig, gray bands scrolled, darker ripples forming and reforming as if a tide had decided to draw pictures. Kara watched the screen and then the ground and then the screen again, the way a parent keeps one eye on a toddler and one on the road. "What do you hope we see?" she asked without looking up. "Enough to change my life," I said before I could sand the sentence into something safer. Then I cleared my throat. "Enough to confirm what Dad thought he saw." "What he saw looks promising on paper," she said. "His notes are unusually meticulous for someone working alone. The journal reads like a field manual, exacting but humble. That's a rare mix." "That was him at his best," I said. 2 lanes later, the morning stretched. We settled into the rhythm of fieldwork. Measure, flag, push, watch, measure, flag, push, watch. The world narrowed to strings and screens and the language of angles. Halfway through the first grid, the scrolling bands began to thicken into something that made Kara's mouth go tight around the corners. "Stop there," she said softly to Ty. He eased the sled back and forth. The lines on the laptop brightened into a series of repeated arcs like the ribs of a whale buried under a gray sea. "Feature?" Aaliyah asked, holding her breath. "Something," Kara murmured. "Same depth across 4 meters. Linear edges. Could be a trench. Could be a wall base. Could be a big old root throwing a tantrum." She smiled at me, forestalling early celebration. "We don't call it a thing until it acts consistently." I didn't realize I'd been gripping my own elbows until my fingers hurt. I let go and flattened my palms against my thighs. The jeans felt damp at the knees where the grass had kissed them. "If it's a wall," I said, making my voice steady. "What does that mean?" "Architecture," Kara said. "And architecture usually means community." We ran the next line. The arcs persisted. Another parallel set materialized at a right angle. Aaliyah's pencil scratched the grid notebook like a tiny saw. Ty kept the sled going at a steady, almost meditative pace. I looked up toward the house and found Nora looking back. She breathed out once, slow, as if she were telling her own heart to keep in time. The first pinch came not from the ground, but from the road. A white crossover slid into the drive too fast for gravel and braked hard enough to spit stones against the ditch. I didn't need the 3 bright notes of the ringtone to recognize my sister's energy before she even opened the door. Paige stepped out in black leggings that whispered money and a quilted vest that looked like it had never met grease. A man got out of the passenger side. Square jaw, neat hair, a clipboard he held the way some people hold their chins. Realtor, my brain supplied, fitted with certainty like a bad crown. "May," Paige called, voice bright enough to cut glass. "You're making quite a party out here." "Good morning," I said, walking toward them with the uncomfortable diplomacy of someone hosting 2 separate realities on one patch of grass. "We're doing a survey." "I can see that," she said, glancing at the flags like they were lawn decorations. "This is Mark." She didn't give his last name. He didn't give it either. "Howdy," Mark said, with a smile that showed a lot of practiced molars. "Quick question. What's the plan for the house?" "The house is in a trust," I said, thinking of letters and tight shoulder muscles. "You'll need to speak with Nora." Nora had already stepped up beside me with a calm that made me want to stand taller. "Good morning," she said. "Can we help you?" "We're looking at comps," Mark said, as if that were a reason for the sun to bother rising. "There's interest in shoreline properties this fall." "There's a survey," Kara said from 20 feet away, voice clipped and professional. She didn't come closer. "We'd appreciate no foot traffic inside the flagged area." Paige's gaze slid over Kara's windbreaker and landed back on me. "A survey of what, exactly?" "History," I said. "Dad found evidence of a site." She laughed with her mouth, not her eyes. "Dad found trouble the way some people find bottle caps." "Sometimes trouble is just the shape of a truth you don't like," Nora said, mild as rain. Paige ignored her and looked at my shoes, my jeans, the mud at my cuff, the way she'd always taken inventory when she wanted to remind me which of us wore the uniform of success. "Well, good for you being outdoorsy," she said. "Meanwhile, Mark here is going to take some exterior photos. Curb appeal matters." "No," I said, and the word felt like a scrape at first and then like a blade. "No photos today. No one steps onto the land without my say-so." She angled her head at the house. "The porch is part of the house." "The porch sits on my dirt," I said. "So does your shoe." For a second, something unguarded flashed in her face, surprise that I'd held a line without flinching. Then the shutters clacked back into place. "Fine," she said, turning the syllable into a verdict. "You'll be hearing from counsel." "There's coffee inside," Nora offered, "if anyone needs to reset their morning." Thank you, Mark said reflexively, taking a step toward the door and then thinking better of it when Nora didn't move aside. He cleared his throat. We'll reschedule. They left a small storm behind them, ruts in the gravel, a taste like coins in my mouth. Kara walked over and handed me a strip of caution tape. Would you like to string this between the corner stakes? She asked. Visual boundaries help remind people where the work is. I nodded. While I tied the bright tape between two posts, my phone buzzed with a voicemail transcription, a paragraph of legalese about rights of access and failure to mitigate property value dilution. I deleted it before the words could calcify. Then I added to my own list, buy no trespass signs and post-it drive. Photograph postings with date stamp. Keep a log. A. Back to it? Kara asked, eyes asking a second question. Are you okay? Back to it, I said. The answer to both questions was yes, though the yes tasted different for each. The next lanes on the radar lit up in a regular grid of anomalies that made the hair on my arms lift. Kara's mouth made a small O. She called Aaliyah over for a second set of eyes, which in fieldwork is the equivalent of a second opinion on an X-ray. You're seeing that, right? She said, keeping her voice low. I'm seeing it, Aaliyah said, and I'm seeing it 3 meters over, so it's not a fluke. What is it? I asked, because hope and superstition were holding hands in my chest, and I didn't trust them to drive. Kara pointed at the repeating dark bands. These could be post holes, she said, or hearths, or pits aligned along a domestic structure. It's too early to say, but the pattern is not natural. Not roots, Ty said, easing the sled to a stop and wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. Roots don't hold a straight line for 60 feet. 60, I repeated. And counting, Kara said. We'll need to run a bigger grid. What does bigger mean in fees and forms? I asked, heat starting in my face because practical questions felt like rain on a parade, and I was the person with her hand out to see if it was really water. Kara matched my frankness. It means we'll file a preliminary report with SHC by the end of the week. It means I'll recommend a temporary protective buffer to discourage development while we learn more. It does not obligate you to any excavation. It opens a door. A door. I pictured Dad in the closet with a pry bar lifting the first board, not to pry money out of the dark, but to let light into it. We'll need to consider tribal consultation, she added, careful with the words. If your father suspected cultural material, we owe that respect. I can make those calls through the proper channels. Please do, I said. It matters. We don't name names until there's consent, she said. Grateful, I think, that I hadn't charged into a list of institutions I wanted to badge this place with. For now, we keep our heads down and our notes straight. Notes. I had those. I went inside and photocopied Dad's journal pages on Nora's old machine that squealed once like a protesting animal, and then did its duty. The copies looked like ghosts of the originals, a little grainy around the edges. I put the real journal back in my bag and put the copies in a folder labeled Field, Parker. The act of labeling put a layer of bark on my resolve. By midday, the field was a giant spreadsheet rendered in string and grass. The radar sled had rolled enough miles to cross town, and we had rectangles filled with whispers that added up to sentences. A pair of dark arcs at the edge of the grid curved toward each other like parentheses. Kara pressed her lips together and made a small, delighted sound that she tried to swallow. If that's a ditch, she said, it's not a backyard project. We broke for lunch on the porch steps that were, according to Paige, both not mine and entirely too rustic. Nora had laid out ham and sliced tomatoes and a jar of mustard with seeds like tiny promises. The biscuit I took apart in my lap steamed like a fresh idea. Ty and Aaliyah ate with the grateful speed of people who measure hunger in field hours instead of clock hours. I have a question, I said to Kara when the first silence had settled into comfort. What do you file that keeps people like... I flicked my eyes toward the road. From bringing in equipment without my permission? Is there a sign that makes them reconsider? There's a protective notice we can issue, she said. It's not a roadblock, but it lets the county know the site is under review. It makes permits harder to rubber stamp. Let's do that, I said. And I'll post my own signs today. Also, she added, lock your gate. There's no gate, I said. Then let's get one, Nora said, already pulling out her notepad. And a chain. Add a camera, Ty put in around a mouthful, and Aaliyah nudged him with her elbow. What? She should know who's sniffing around. Documentation, Kara said, lifting her water bottle. It sounds boring, but boring keeps the wolf's teeth off your ankles. Boring was a word I could turn into a plan. After lunch, I drove into town and bought 3 metal signs, no trespassing in red block letters, and a trail cam that promised to email me if a raccoon so much as blinked near the sensor. The cashier asked if I was protecting deer corn or lake toys, and I said, history. And she laughed and said, aren't we all? And handed me a receipt with the date and time like a notary. Back at the property, I mounted the signs at the drive and took photos with my phone in the same frame, so the date stamp smiled back at me like a tiny guard. I screwed the camera to a tree with deliberate, satisfying turns. The metal bit into wood with a squeak that sounded like protest and consent all at once. While I tightened the final screw, my phone buzzed, a new message from Paige, short and sweet. Cease contact with outside parties. Re-site. Until council reviews. You're exposed, May. I typed and deleted 4 replies. The 5th one was 2 words. Noted. M. Incoming, Nora asked. She'd appeared beside me with a bag of tools and a coil of chain like she was ready to build the world we needed out of hardware. Legal peacocking, I said. She smiled that small, fierce smile I'd started to understand the day before. Then we'll give them something else to look at. By late afternoon, the radar had revealed a pattern that made even the quietest member of the team whistle. A rectangle inside a rectangle, edges clean. Kara crouched to rest her hands on her knees and tilted her head the way you do when a painting won't resolve until you switch angles. This footprint is larger than we usually see in domestic contexts up here, she said. If these signatures are what I think they are, we're looking at communal space, possibly ceremonial. You don't get that without people, and you don't get people on that scale without a story. My heart did something reckless in my chest. I thought of Dad kneeling in his closet with his pen. I thought of him choosing to write down wonder instead of cash it. The grid in front of us looked like a net we'd laid on a lake to see what swam beneath. It was full, but not with fish. Next steps? I asked, forcing my voice to stay practical. I'll file the preliminary with SHC, she said. I'll recommend the buffer and put you down as the landowner contact. We'll ask for permission to do a limited test excavation, 2 or 3 1-meter units, once the right conversations happen. No rush unless you're under threat. Threat is a relative term, I said, picturing Paige's relay team of attorneys tying their shoes. Then we move at sane speed, Kara said. Sane speed gets you protection. Panic speed gets you mistakes. Nora tugged her sleeves down against the evening air. Sane sounds like the future I want to live in, she said. We packed the gear into the trucks as the sky shifted toward that particular lake light that looks like someone polished the air. Before she left, Kara took out a square of Tyvek and a Sharpie and wrote in neat block letters. Site under review. No subsurface disturbance. Contact SHC. Benton. She handed me a copy. Post this in your window, she said. It's not a police order, it's a courtesy advise. But courtesy is a language most clerks read. Clerks, I said, filing the word away where I kept the practical saints. When the trucks pulled out, the yard looked like a field dressed for prom. Flags bright against the green, strings catching the last light. I stood with Nora in the hush that follows good work. Somewhere far across the water, a boat motor coughed and then settled. You all right? She asked. I'm not wrong, I said, smiling at how my own grammar had changed. I'm doing the right, harder thing. It feels like a shirt that fits." She touched the back of her knuckles to my shoulder, the way you might test soup for heat. "I made stew," she said. "There's enough for you to take home." Inside, while the pot whispered and the house warmed our bones, I wrote an email to Kara thanking her for the day and confirming that she had my permission to file the preliminary notice and to initiate the consultations. I copied myself at a new email address I just made for the site, Lakeshore Rigid, so the paper trail wouldn't get swallowed by my life's other fires. Then I drafted a second message to Paige, careful as if I were threading a needle in a moving car. Paige, I am coordinating with SHC regarding potential cultural material on the land. No disturbances occurring, non-invasive survey only. As landowner, I have posted the property. Please direct all legal correspondence through the attorney who read the will last week. I won't discuss further until advised. I didn't press send. I saved it to drafts and felt about 10 years older and 10 pounds lighter. On my way out, I stopped in the closet and set the board back the way it had been, the knife of my fingernail making the final push. I laid my palm on the wood for a breath. "We're doing it right," I told the dark. "We're going to be the people you wanted us to be." The next 2 days unspooled in a rhythm of small, decisive acts. I met a guy at the end of the drive who installed a farm gate between 2 sturdy posts, set the chain, and showed me how the lock preferred to be coaxed at a slight angle. I laminated the Tyvek notice and hung it in the front window with clear tape. I moved the trail camera to get a better angle on the turn-in. I bought a spiral notebook with a red cover and wrote on the first page, Site Log. Day 1. SHC survey grid established. GPR suggests linear anomalies, possible architectural features. Visitors. Page unknown male, RE. No access granted. Even writing the initials felt like a boundary. You get to be a noun in my book, I thought. You don't get to narrate my verbs. In town, I made still more boring moves that felt like sandbags in the best way. I opened a separate checking account tagged for site-related expenses and put in $40. Small, but mine. I asked the post office to hold any mail address to Lakeshore Trust so it wouldn't sit in the box out by the road where anyone with bad manners could take it. I printed 3 copies of the will in the trust papers and stuck them in a cheap binder with colored tabs. Land, house, contacts. On the 3rd morning, Kara called before I could pour coffee. 2 things, she said without preamble. 1. Preliminary filed. You'll get the auto-acknowledgement by noon. 2. You may receive contact from a reporter. I did not give out your number. News has a way of sniffing along the seams. The porch boards under my feet felt like they'd grown narrower. Already? I asked, surprised by how close to the surface my exhaustion sat. I flagged the file as sensitive, she said. It won't stop interest. It will discourage people with badges from assuming entitlement. You handled your sister well. You'll handle this. You weren't here for the part where my stomach tried to leave my body, I said. I was here for the part where you said no without flinching, she said. For the record, most people flinch. After I hung up, I poured 2 coffees and carried one to Nora, who was already at the table with her ledger. We need to talk about the driveway, I said. She might try to say I can't use it because the porch touches it. Nora flipped to a page she'd dog-eared. The legal description, she said, tapping a paragraph she'd transcribed from memory, shows the drive as an easement across the land to the house. Neither party gets to deny the other access. Unless she wants to bring groceries in by canoe, she'll behave. We should paint a line anyway, I said. Not to divide us, to guide guests. We did that afternoon. A simple white stripe down the center of the compacted earth where it passed the porch. Not straight like a ruler line, but steady like a hand that owns its purpose. It turned the drive into a sentence with grammar, and suddenly the space felt less like a place someone could commandeer and more like a place people shared if they had manners. At dusk, as birds stitched shadows into the pines, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I answered because not answering is its own kind of answer. "Ms. Parker," a woman's voice asked. She gave a name I didn't clock because the word reporter rang in my head like a dropped skillet. "I'm calling to see if you can confirm that the state is investigating a significant historic site on your property." "We're not investigating," I said, defaulting to Kara's language. "We're surveying." And I don't have any comment beyond that. "Do you have any concerns about how this might affect the value of your property, given that your sister has listed the home in a trust for sale?" "Value," I said, keeping my tone even, "is not always a number you can print on a flyer." "So you're not seeking to profit?" "I'm seeking to do the right thing," I said, and before she could convert that into a headline, I added, "You can attribute that to me." "Can I come out and see the sightlines?" she asked. "Get a photo? Human interest?" "No," I said, and let the words stand without apology. "We're protecting the location until the appropriate conversations are had. Thank you for understanding." She didn't, not really, but she registered my gait. "If you change your mind," she said. "I'll let you know," I said, and we both knew I wouldn't. That night, I slept hard and dreamless and woke with the kind of square resolve you get only after a day of acting like the person you hope to be. When I fired up the kettle, I saw the red light on the trail camera's receiver blinking. Motion detection at 1:12 a.m. I tapped through the photos and saw 3 deer, and 5 minutes later, a human silhouette at the edge of the drive, standing still, as if listening to the house breathe. I printed the picture, slid it into the log, and wrote, "Unknown individual at 1:12 a.m. No entry. Chain intact." I didn't forward it to Paige. I didn't need the interpretive dance she'd do with it. Instead, I texted Kara the photo and the time, and put the print under a magnet on the fridge, because old technology has a way of making truth weighty. Midweek, the preliminary acknowledgement arrived in my inbox at 11:34 a.m., as promised. My name on it made the whole thing feel both official and personal. A letter to the land, addressed care of me. The language was dry enough to need water, but there, in the second paragraph, was the phrase that changed the way I stood in my own yard. "Temporary protective consideration recommended." It didn't mean offense. It meant a pause. Sometimes a pause is the strongest verb in a sentence. I walked out and stood in the middle of the grid. The strings hummed a little in the afternoon breeze. I dropped one hand to the grass and pressed my palm to the ground. The earth was warm. I thought of how many feet had warmed it before mine, how many stories might be layered under there like quilts, each stitched by a hand that hadn't imagined my life, or my sister's sharp letters, or my father's neat pen. "Okay," I said aloud, to whatever and whomever might be listening. "Okay." From the porch, Nora called, "Stew's ready when you are," as if she'd heard me declare my minor truce with the planet. When I left that evening, I locked the new gate and tugged the chain twice, the way the installer had shown me. The sound the lock made was small and satisfying, a click like a period at the end of a sentence that had taken 4 days to write. On the drive back into town, the check engine light glowed but felt less like a warning and more like a reminder that not everything in my life would suddenly become a museum exhibit. I had to keep working the boring list. I had to answer a pharmacy robocall. I had to set 2 alarms because a team would come back on Friday with more flags and a level of rigor that would either make the grid bloom or teach us to be patient. I could live with both outcomes. The part I couldn't live with anymore was pretending I didn't know which woman I was when a line needed holding. That, at least, was settled. On Friday, I'd pick up a box of donuts for the crew and a stack of legal folders for myself. I'd put on jeans that liked kneeling and a shirt I didn't mind muddying. I'd write in the log and date my entries and save my drafts unsent until the heat drained out of them. I'd lay out the tape and watch the screen and feel the sweet, ordinary shock of being on time for my own life. Out by the lake, A loon called again in the blue dark, and the sound ran down my spine like a zipper, drawing everything closed for the night. The world exhaled. So did I. Tomorrow the lines would go down straighter. Tomorrow the picture would sharpen. And if my sister made noise, well, the tape between the stakes would sing a small song in the wind that said what needed saying better than I ever could. Here, not yours, not mine, ours, if we behave. The envelope hit the porch like a thrown stone. I'd just set 2 mugs to cool when a man in a windbreaker stepped back from the door as if the wood might bite him. "Service," he said, and was gone before I finished opening my mouth. Inside the big white envelope, notice of hearing in capital letters that wanted to be a shout. My name. My sister's name. Monday, 9:20 a.m., motion for temporary restraint. The language sounded like a scolding metronome. Cease and desist non-essential activities. Encumbrance that materially diminishes market value. Irreparable harm. "Good morning," Nora said, and it sounded like an antidote. She'd been flipping pancakes the size of a hand, the batter bowl tucked against her hip. When I didn't speak, she wiped her hands and took the papers gently, like you take a glass from someone with a cut. Her eyes moved without hurrying. "All right," she said. "We'll handle this." "We?" The word eased something in my ribs. "We," she said again, with the kind of certainty that closes a door behind weather. I texted Kara a photo of the notice. She called in under a minute. "They always try the word irreparable," she said dryly. "Judges like the shape of it. It makes everyone feel useful." "Can a court stop you from walking with a radar sled?" I asked. "Not if the landowner invited us," she said. "And you did. We'll loop our counsel at SHC. Meanwhile, keep doing exactly what you're doing. Document, don't disturb, and breathe." "Breathe, then." I poured the coffee, took one sip, and it landed in my stomach like a calmly worded memo. Do the boring things, and do them well. By 9, the trucks arrived, tires fizzing over damp gravel. A night storm had marched across the lake, and the world smelled scrubbed. Ty and Aaliyah climbed out with that early shift optimism people bring when they know they'll be dirty by noon. Kara took the porch steps in 2 long strides. "Morning," she said. I handed her the notice. She skimmed, blew out a small breath, and folded it in half. "Annoying, not catastrophic. We'll give the judge something to be proud of denying." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we show restraint like we invented the concept," she said, already walking toward yesterday's grid, "and we make the science impossible to ignore." We extended the strings beyond yesterday's neat rectangle until the yard looked like a giant quilt template. The radar sled shushed over grass made slick by rain. The scrolling bands on the laptop were clearer today, as if the storm had rinsed the static out of the soil. "Hold," Kara said softly. Ty stopped as if she'd pressed a button on him. She pointed. The screen showed a thickening arc and then another, shallow, parallel, like someone had drawn a smile under the earth and then drawn another to keep it company. "Ditch?" Aaliyah whispered. "Maybe," Kara said. "Maybe more than one." We ran 2 more lanes. The arcs curved toward each other and then away, not random but not yet like any picture I could name. The hair on my arms lifted. I remembered what Dad had written. You don't own the past, you share it. Today the past felt like a house guest. Polite, present, about to change the seating chart. We shifted the grid north. The sled hummed across ground I'd always thought of as just that. Ground, not story. The screen's gray rain began to resolve into repeated dark pulses at regular intervals, as if someone had set posts in a line and the earth remembered where they'd been. 6 feet apart, 6 feet again, and again. "Not trees," Ty said, smiling without looking up. "Trees don't hire surveyors." "Posts," Kara said, mouth tightening around the word to keep from wanting it too much. "If that's a palisade, it's not a backyard fence." A palisade. The word made my chest go hollow and spacious at once. The first pinch of the day came from the road, because of course it did. A black SUV, nicer than yesterday's, glided in and parked crooked across the end of the drive like a punctuation mark that refused to pick a side. Paige unfolded herself from the driver's seat, wearing courtroom hair and a coat that had seen more boardrooms than weather. A different man got out of the passenger side, older, with a briefcase. Counsel, not realtor. "May," she sang, as if we were at brunch. "Have you seen your mail?" "You sent a stranger to hit my door like a drum and run," I said. "Yes, I saw it." "This is Mr. Holcomb," she said, gesturing with the relaxed ownership of someone introducing her watch. "We're simply asking the court to preserve value while a sale is contemplated." "By whom?" I asked. "The trust," she said, as if I were being deliberately slow. "The house is in the trust." "The land is not," I said. "The land has a voice today." "Ms. Parker," the lawyer said, turning his face toward me with professional sorrow, "non-essential activities that affect marketability are considered waste under—" "Walking isn't waste," I said. "And reading isn't disturbance." "Site under review notices tend to spook buyers," he said. "Surely you can understand our concern." "I understand your preference for words that startle people into compliance," Nora said mildly from the porch. She had a dish towel over her shoulder and the kind of posture that makes men adjust their manners without knowing why. "There's coffee if anyone wants to remember how to behave." Holcomb's eyes flicked to her and then away. People who practice power sometimes didn't recognize it when it came without a tie. He tried another tack. "We're willing to discuss a limited access schedule for photographers." "No," I said. It felt less like a blade this time and more like opening a gate to only the right pasture. "Then we'll see you on Monday," Paige said, smile bright and brittle. "May the best reading of the law win." As they turned, I said, "Paige?" She paused. "Your envelope used the phrase irreparable harm." "I'll bring photos of the trail camera." I let the sentence hang. She didn't ask what the pictures showed. She didn't want to know. "Enjoy your string," she said, and left. When the sound of their tires faded, the yard exhaled. The flags shook themselves and resumed holding their ground. "Back to it," I said, and if my voice was shaking, it was the kind of shake you get after a sprint, not after a fright. We pushed the sled across a swath that sloped gently toward the lake. The screen's gray bands deepened, and a new shape began to declare itself, a large rectangle within a larger arc, like a room tucked inside a hug. Kara crouched, squinting, then pulled off her cap and smoothed her hair with a nervous gesture that told me we were leaning into the mouth of something significant. "If these are post molds, and this is a ditch," she said, placing her finger over the screen an inch above the line she didn't want to smudge, "then we're not looking at a scatter. We're looking at planned space." "Village?" I asked, feeling foolish for saying the big word out loud. "Potentially," she said. "The pattern suggests communal architecture. That turns a property issue into a cultural one." A wind moved across the lake and touched all the trees at once. The water picked up a skin of ripples that moved like thought. We broke at noon because Nora put bowls in our hands, and that ends arguments. While we ate on the steps, Kara opened her notebook and flipped to a map she'd drawn last night from memory. A hand-sketched shoreline, the hump of our ridge, a dot for the porch. She began to pencil in the new lines, using the strings in the yard as the real-world grid and translating the pattern in her mind. When she finished, the page looked like a blueprint that could build a story. "If this holds," she said, tapping the rectangle gently, "we'll need to extend the grid north, east, and west. And—" she glanced at me, measuring. "Under the house." "Under?" Heat went to my neck, then drained out of me. "Under the—" "Don't panic," she said. "It doesn't mean we go through floorboards. It means the footprint likely predates the structure. It happens more than people think." "It means," Nora said, not looking rattled, that the house will be standing on a different kind of history than people assume. It also means your sister will find selling the structure as is less charming, I said, and the practical truth of that settled me, like a hand on my back. We widened the grid, string by string, until the field looked like a giant crossword puzzle with no black squares. The radar sled sang its page-turning song. The laptop drew its gray river of data and then very slowly stopped being a river and started being a map. The post molds, the ghosts of hand-dug holes that once held wood, lined up in disciplined rows. The ditch curved in a way that suggested a perimeter, not a random erosion. In the southeast quadrant, a neat cluster of anomalies arranged themselves around a central dark oval. "Cook area?" Ty asked. "Possibly," Kara said, "or a meeting space with hearths, or something sacred. We don't name a church without an invitation." We held that inviolable care like an umbrella over the rest of the afternoon. No one stepped hard inside any flagged square. When the wind gusted and the strings hummed, we stepped back and let the sound say whatever it needed to say. Toward evening, a cloud shouldered up from the far side of the lake and put its hand over the sun. The sky kept walking east anyway. We were an hour from losing light when Aaliyah, walking perimeter, called, "May?" Her voice was careful. I went to her. At the very edge of the grid, the night rain had bitten into the bank just enough to slough off a thin face of soil. In that fresh cut, half in and half out of darkness, lay a shard of pottery the color of rich bread. Even under damp earth, its carved lines showed, river curves and dots in a pattern I'd seen in Dad's photos, and then in my dreams when the house was quiet. The part of me that was a child reached for it without permission. The part of me that had read the log and written a list pulled my hand back like it had touched a stove. The air between my palm and the shard felt alive, like the breath of a person you don't want to wake. "No one touches it," Kara said, appearing as if the earth had brought her. "We stabilize the bank. We cover." She and Ty moved like practiced nurses. A strip of breathable fabric, she called it geotextile, laid gently over the exposed face, a soft nest of clean sand scooped in by hand to support without pressing. No shovels, no blades. Their competence made something in my back unclench. When we stood again, the shard was out of sight and safer than it had been when we first saw it, which felt like a miracle, because most days seeing is how damage begins. "That," Kara said quietly, "is why we move with care. Erosion will keep talking whether we listen or not." I looked at the bank, at the fabric now the color of rain, and felt something change shape inside me. Until that minute, I had been balancing two ledgers, cash and time. Sell some trees, my earlier brain had thought. Permit a driveway across a corner, lease a season of access for kayaks, all the little human trades we do when we're trying to make a month behave. The shard under the geotextile wasn't just pretty, it was a declaration. It said, "Any dollar you could shake loose by hurrying will cost you a story that makes you a person you recognize." The reversal slid into place so cleanly I didn't feel a click. I felt a settling. I wasn't going to sell anything quick. I wasn't going to trade long for short. I was going to be the steward Dad asked me to be, even if it meant doing math with new numbers. "Okay," I said aloud, half to the bank and half to myself. "We're in it for the long game." Nora heard me and didn't say I told you so. She just folded her arms and nodded once, the way you do when a friend says they're getting sober, and you know it's not about applause. On Sunday night, I set out clothes that wouldn't shout at a judge and ironed a shirt I'd only ironed twice. I made 2 folders, one fat with copies, preliminary notice, site log entries, photographs of posted signs and the gate and the polite Tyvek sheet in the window, and the other thin with the letter Dad had written, because carrying it felt like a spine. I slept 6 hours that felt like 3, and woke with the particular calm that comes when you don't have any lies left to manage. The courthouse smelled like dust and lemon floor cleaner. The clerk behind the window had the kind of competence that makes you less frightened by reminding you that the world runs on people who know where the forms live. She pointed us to the right room. We sat on a wooden bench with other people who were all about to have a day shaped by someone in a robe. Paige arrived with Holcomb, hair arranged like a promise, heels that hit the floor like punctuation. She didn't sit next to me. She didn't look over. I tried to remember we once shared a bedroom painted yellow that the landlords called Sunshine and we called Old Mustard. It didn't help. When our case was called, I stood beside a small table while the judge looked at us the way a careful mechanic looks under a hood. Not impressed, not hostile, just determined to get the thing idling again. Holcomb started with irreparable harm as predicted. He said phrases like material diminution and public notice that chills buyers. He gestured subtly to my shoes, my hair, the fact that I had not hired a suit to speak for me. When it was my turn, my voice showed up with me. "Your Honor," I said, and the words didn't shake. "I'm the owner of the land. I invited a state team to conduct a non-invasive reading of the ground. No dirt has been disturbed. The state has filed a preliminary notice and recommended a protective buffer. I've posted the property, locked the gate, and kept a log. I'm not selling. I'm stewarding. The only irreparable harm would come from someone rushing a sale before we understand what's there." I slid the fat folder forward with photos on top, strings in low light, the polite sign in my window, the date-stamped no trespass postings, a picture of the gate with the chain, the lock angled the way the installer taught me. The clerk took them in a stack and handed them to the judge, who looked longer at the images than lawyers like. Holcomb recovered with a complaint about encumbrances without fiduciary consideration, and the judge cut in mildly, "Counselor, you use 3 nouns in a row as if they were an argument." The room breathed out a laugh and then got serious again. "Has the state weighed in?" the judge asked. "Yes," I said, and held up the preliminary acknowledgement with its polite, dry phrase, "Temporary protective consideration recommended." The judge read, eyebrows climbing a millimeter, which in that room counted as shock. He tapped the page. "Ms. Parker," he said, meaning me, "I'm disinclined to enjoin a landowner from inviting the state to examine potential cultural materials carefully. Ms. Parker," he said again, turning to my sister, and I felt the strange hollow of sharing a name in a room where names spat sparks. "You retain the ability to pursue sale of the structure within the constraints the law requires. You do not have the right to compel the landowner to pretend they own a parking lot." "The motion for temporary restraint denied," he wrote, calm as a grocery list, and then, because he could, he added, "No subsurface disturbance absent consent of the landowner and SHC, pending further notice." It was not a fence. It was a pause you could lean against. When we left the courtroom, Paige walked beside me as if we were on a narrow sidewalk and politeness had rules. "You win a round," she said, "but you'll run out of money before you run out of squares to string." "You might be right," I said, because refusing her a portion of truth would only waste energy. "But I won't run out of help." She looked past me at Nora, who had waded through the hearing with her hands folded loosely in her lap, like a person who had decades of patience and reserve. "You're taking the word of a woman who makes pancakes on a weekday." "I'm taking the word of the ground," I said. "And a commission that writes in dry sentences and doesn't sell houses." She made that tight smile that meant the conversation was over for her and walked away, heels saying too loud a goodbye. In the parking lot, Nora handed me a biscuit wrapped in a napkin from her purse. "For victory or consolation," she said. It tasted like both. On the way back to the lake, I stopped at a bank and asked what it would take to open a donor-advised fund or something like it with $42 and a promise. The banker, a man who had already perfected the art of not laughing at small beginnings, suggested a simpler path for now, a separate savings account labeled for stewardship. He typed with an efficiency that made me feel wealthier than I was. I named the account Lakeshore Stewardship. It felt like writing my own headline. At the property, Kara had beaten us back. She stood in the field with her hands in her pockets, looking at the grid the way a captain looks at a coastline she once only had on a chart. "Good news?" she asked when she saw my face. "Good enough," I said, and told her the judge's 2 sentences. "Then we work," she said, sane speed. We pushed the grid west into a patch of scrub I'd always ignored. The sled's whispering wheels found more of the same story. Posts, arcs, an open space that wasn't nothing but wasn't a room. Kara's pencil drew, erased, drew again until the map in her notebook looked like the beginnings of a necklace, a strand of shapes that made sense when you backed up. By late afternoon, we had a footprint that reached beyond the yard, beyond the line of older pines, toward a boundary that, on paper, was the county's. The story wasn't mine. It ran under several names and none. That, paradoxically, made me feel more like a person with a job and less like a woman with a problem. "What happens if the site extends onto county land?" I asked. "Then," Kara said, "you'll have allies you didn't know you had." Allies. The word made me stand straighter. It felt less like politics and more like topography. We cleaned up in long shadows and stood for a minute in the kind of quiet that happens at the end of a good day when everybody has earned their dinner. On a whim, I took Dad's journal from my bag and set it on one of the corner stakes, opened the page with his sketch circles and arrows. His tidy letters looked so sure of me. I wanted to cry from gratitude instead of sadness for once. "Hey, Ray," Ty said softly, like a man tipping his hat. "We're doing it right." On the porch, Nora taped the judge's printed order next to the polite Tyvek notice. 2 pieces of paper, both made of cellulose, both briefly more persuasive than a raised voice. The window glass reflected the flag-bright field, and layered over it, mine and Nora's faces. We looked like people on a cusp. That evening, with stew spooned into bowls again because a person in a fight should not also have to reinvent dinner, I wrote 3 emails. One to Kara, memorializing what we'd done and what we'd not done. One to the county clerk, attaching the judge's order and the preliminary acknowledgement, so they'd have something to look at if a permit application for routine yard work crossed a desk. And one to myself in the new site address subject line, "Long game, body. Remember that the work is the reward. Also, buy more string." I did not email Paige. She would do what she did. The trail camera would keep blinking its patient red eye. The gate would take the weight of my hand and answer with a click, like a sentence settling. When I left, the grid traced pale lines in the dusk, and the lake held the last light in its palm. A loon called, not in warning this time, but like someone singing the last verse of a song everyone knows. I stood a long minute and let my breath match the water. I'd come up here ready to sell a future for a month of relief. Now I knew how to measure my life in a different unit. The math would be hard and the calendar would still roll its shoulders at me. But I had a ledger that wasn't a bank's. I had a stack of boring documents that said stop, wait, listen. I had a house I didn't own on land I did, a woman who cooked like patience, and a commission that wrote dry sentences that saved lives without ever having to say the word. And I had a box with my father's neat pen in it telling me who to be. For once, I didn't feel like arguing with him. Tomorrow, the grid would stretch again. Tomorrow, the story might grow a border no one expected. Tomorrow, if a reporter called, I'd say the thing I'd decided to say whenever a stranger tried to make me summarize a sacred thing. We're reading. We're sharing. We're staying. Not yours, not mine. Ours, if we behave. The backhoe's teeth hovered over my flags like a jaw about to bite. I was halfway down the drive with a box of donuts when the machine swung across the ditch and the operator feathered the controls. Boom arm taut, shadow falling over the red string. The engine's diesel throb shook the air in my ribs. 2 men in County Orange stood by their truck with a clipboard. The smaller one lifted a hand in a sorry not sorry wave. "Drainage maintenance," he called. "We've got a work order for the right-of-way." "Stop," I said, voice bigger than I remembered owning. "You're within my posted buffer." He shaded his eyes at the Tyvek sheet in the window, and the red no trespassing signs that now felt like flimsy paper against a ton of steel. The bucket dipped an inch without touching ground. Behind me, the porch door banged and Nora came down the steps at a trot, with the judge's order in a plastic sleeve like a shield. "Hold up," she called, hair caught by the wind. "We've got a court order." I climbed the bank, donuts thunking against my hip, and handed the operator the plastic sleeve under the safety rail. He cut the throttle to idle. The yard went from roar to a loud shiver. "Look," I said, keeping my hands where he could see them like we were all trying not to spook a horse. "No subsurface disturbance without landowner consent and the commissions. I'm the landowner. You don't have consent." He read, lips moving. The man with the clipboard squinted the way a person squints when printing turns into law. "We clear this ditch twice a year," he said. "Flood season's coming." "Then let's talk about how to keep water from eating history," I said. "The commission can coordinate erosion control that doesn't dig. Sandbags, straw wattles, whatever keeps the ground where the ground wants to be." The operator rubbed his jaw. "I don't get paid to argue paperwork." "You get paid to not make my week worse," I said softer, and slid the donut box along the backhoe step until it bumped his boot. "Sugar helps negotiations." He huffed and half-smiled despite himself, handed the plastic sleeve down to the clipboard, and climbed out of the cab to call his supervisor. The man on the other end had the power to turn engines off with his voice. I watched it happen. Shoulders dropped, posture loosened. "We'll hold," the operator said at last, hanging up. "You get your folks to call our folks. We'll reroute." "Thank you," I said, and only when the bucket swung back and the arm folded itself like a sleeping grasshopper did my knees remember how to be knees. By the time Kara pulled in, the backhoe was parked under the tall pines like a tamed animal, and 2 neon safety vests were leaning against their truck, eating jelly donuts as if diplomacy were a breakfast food. I explained. She listened. Her first sentence was not, "We almost lost everything, but let's get wattles and plastic down along the bank before the next rain." We moved. Ty and Aaliyah arrived with a roll of straw and stakes, and the morning turned into the kind of work that leaves your arms humming, securing the bank, tucking earth under breathable cloth, persuading water to walk a gentler path. The ground accepted our care, with a patience that felt like instruction. By noon, the news vans found us. 2 rolled up together like a pair of sleek beetles, antennas unfurling, doors bristling with microphones. A woman in blazer and boots I wouldn't wear to fold laundry climbed out and smiled at me with rehearsed warmth. I recognized her voice from the phone, the reporter who'd asked if I planned to profit. "Miss Parker," she said, greasing my last name like a pan. "Jenna Marin, could we talk?" "Off my flagged area," I said, "and not about coordinates." "Of course," she said brightly. "We respect sacred sites." We didn't say the word sacred. I kept it in my mouth like a seed I wasn't ready to spit into her hand. I stood with my back to the yard so the string and the flags wouldn't be in the frame. The cameraman shouldered the lens like a polite cannon. A second van disgorged another crew that began to measure our boundaries with smiles. "What's happening here?" Jenna asked. "We're reading the ground," I said, non-invasively. "The state has recommended protective consideration while we learn. We're not digging." She nodded, as if she liked those words on her tape. "And how does this affect the sale of the home on the property?" Before I answered, a familiar engine note chinned up the drive and white-crossed gravel as if it had only ever practiced being late on purpose. Paige's car. She parked with precision designed for on-camera entrances and stepped out in a navy dress that made the pines look like props. "Hello, Jenna," she called, voice turned 3 clicks toward glamour, happy to provide perspective. "Miss Parker," Jenna said, one hand to her earpiece as if it were whispering stock tips, "are you the co-owner?" Paige didn't even flinch at the prefix. "I represent the trust that owns the structure," she said. "We're concerned." She tilted her chin toward my window, where the polite notice and the court order looked suddenly like poster board at a science fair. This kind of signage chills buyers. "Protects culture," I said. "Devalues property," she said. "Names what matters," I said. Behind Jenna's shoulder, a second camera framed us both like a boxing match. Nora stepped between our heat and the lens with a tray of iced tea and the kind of smile that suggests your mother raised you right. "Break?" she said to the crews. "It's hot." Camera shoulders dropped. The crews took cups because thirst outranks narrative. Paige's jaw tightened the way it did when food interrupted her thesis. I exhaled. Jenna's producer sidled up to me. "We're doing a longer piece for Discovery Network," she said. "Not just the hit for tonight. They might be interested in supporting site stabilization, equipment, materials, if we can follow the journey." "Blur the lake," I said. "Don't show the road. No drone. Too many angles. And you don't publish until the tribes we consult say we're not causing harm." "Those are unusual conditions," she said, already measuring how much story she could carry under them. "So, is a place that's not for sale at any price," I said. "You want to help?" "Help protect. The part you can film is people making good choices." "To be clear," Jenna said, returning to her script, "you're turning down money." "I'm turning down the parts of money that make you forget why you started," I said. "Ask me again in a week when I have to buy more string." We negotiated a boundary dance that afternoon. Crews filmed the backhoe crew laying erosion control along the county right-of-way, while Kara narrated the physics of water in a tone that made science sound like kindness. I stood on my drive and said the same sentence 3 ways, all ending with "we're reading, not digging." Paige took a call in a voice pitched for microphones and used the words fiduciary and exposure, and then smiled down the lens like the camera was a person who agreed with her. By evening, the vans rolled out, their taillights winking like they knew leaving wasn't the same thing as letting go. The yard sagged with a particular fatigue, too many eyes on a thing not ready to be looked at. We were washing cups when Kara's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, then lifted her eyebrows at me. "Tribal Historic Preservation Office," she said, returning my call. Nora turned off the faucet so we could hear. Kara introduced herself, then me. The voice on the other end had the patient weight of a person who understands time in different units than television. We talked about what we had, and more importantly, what we didn't. No open units, no soil moved, no photographs of coordinates leaving the property. We talked about the pottery pattern Dad had sketched and the ditch arcs and the post molds marching like disciplined ghosts. "We'll send a representative," the voice said. "We appreciate your restraint." Then, after a beat with more meaning than periods carry, "Thank you for not posting pictures online." "Some things get smaller when you make them public too fast," I said. "Some things disappear," the voice said, and we sat a moment with that. We set a day for a visit. I wrote it in the site log in block letters that looked like they wanted to be taken seriously. THPO visit Friday 10 a.m. I didn't write the name, not my name to write. That night, thunder lined itself up west of the lake and paced the horizon like someone clearing their throat. By midnight, rain came in hard, big drops that hit the porch like thrown pebbles and then became a sheet. I lay awake and counted between flash and rumble, the number shrinking until the house's old bones answered the sky. Somewhere around 2, a limb cracked. A clean, sickening sound, and I was already pulling on boots when the trail camera chime lit the kitchen in a small red pulse. "Nora," I called, and she was up with a flashlight before I finished her name. We found the downed pine at the bank, roots wrenching a disk of earth the size of a small room. The root ball had pulled up a slice of soil like cake, layers visible in the flashlight beam, damp and eloquent. In the brown plain, 3 shapes darkened the way post molds darken when rain smooths the commentary. My breath snagged. "We need to stabilize," I said. The rain turned words into useless flags. "Tyvek and sand," Nora said. "Gone already for the rolls and the buckets we'd staged after the backhoe scare. We moved like a small, sensible army. Cut, lay, press, support, tuck." In the beam's halo, a sliver of decorated pottery showed, then hid, pattern glinting, river curves and dots like stars. The sight flooded me with a mix of awe and fear so pure it felt like an element. "Don't touch," I said aloud to myself, as if my body were a child that needed reminding. We worked until the rain softened and the storm walked east. My hands shook from effort and a little from reverence. When we finished, the bank looked like a field hospital, patched, protected, waiting for morning. I took a photo from far enough to show no detail and texted Kara. "Tree down, bank exposed. We stabilized. Call it 6. Her reply came 3 dots later. "Awake or woken, I didn't know. On my way at daylight. Proud of you." In the gray strip before dawn, we stood under the pines and watched the lake smooth its ruffled skin. My hair was pasted to my neck. Nora's sweatshirt clung to her like it had been dyed onto her. We leaned on shovels like farmers in a painting and didn't speak for a while. "You all right?" she asked finally. "I'm the kind of tired that makes you believe in naps," I said, "and the kind of awake that makes naps a rumor." She bumped my shoulder with the kind of affection that doesn't need permission. "After coffee, we'll both remember our names." By 9, the yard held 3 kinds of vehicles: our familiar trucks, a sedan with a state plate, a plain SUV that didn't announce anything but that a person who preferred not to declare themselves had arrived. Kara set the tone with a few simple sentences to everyone on the grass. "No digging, no crossing string. Our visitors are here for consultation and respect." The representative from the tribal office stepped out, stood a moment with eyes on the water, and then walked the grid with Kara. Paced, turned, paced again. We gave space. The word sacred still didn't get used. Not because it wasn't appropriate, but because some words work better when you don't point directly at them. When they reached the stabilized bank, the representative crouched and studied the protective cloth laid over the exposed plain, the way you look at a covered body at a funeral, with respect, curiosity, and the knowledge that what matters is hidden on purpose. "Thank you," they said. "This is good." We gathered at the porch table to talk. Papers spread. My log, Kara's maps, the preliminary notice, the judge's thin, powerful sentence. The representative outlined a set of steps that were less like boxes to check and more like a set of manners to practice. Expanded buffer, signage phrased to discourage curiosity without baiting it, a single point of contact for questions, and if we ever did open a unit, ceremony and consent before the first trowel's edge touched anything. "We can do all of that," I said. "We've begun what we can do without asking anyone to trust us further than we've earned." "Good," they said, and their smile reached their eyes. The near miss with the backhoe, the night storm, the exposed bank, all of it had built a case more convincing than any speech. By lunch, the Commission's counsel had emailed a draft emergency protection order, and by 3, the county posted a laminated notice at the drive. No ground disturbance. Protected site under review. Violators subject to penalties. It wasn't a miracle. It was paper and ink and a signature, and the weight of a system when you get enough decent people to lean in the same direction at once. Paige drove by at 4:30, slowed to read the sign, and didn't stop. The look she gave the paper was the look she used to give me when I wore the wrong shoes to church. The SUV behind her, the one from Morning News, did stop. Jenna stepped out, lifted a camera only to lower it again when she read the words. She waved instead, a small human gesture that didn't ask for anything. That evening, I met a man from the clerk's office at a plastic table near the copy machine and recorded a protective covenant on the land, a promise that ran with the soil, not with my mood. It restricted disturbance within the flagged area absent written permission from me and the commission. It acknowledged interests beyond mine. It carved a corridor from the drive to the porch so groceries and wheelchairs could keep doing what they do without endangering anything beneath. Nora read each paragraph with the patience of a person who'd measured 2x4s by eye for most of her adult life, and nodded. "I agree," she said, signing for the trust where she had the right to sign. The clerk stamped and slid copies across the table that smelled faintly of toner. I put one copy behind the tab in my binder, labeled Land. I put another in a cheap picture frame and set it on the mantel because sometimes you have to turn your life into decor to believe it. We slept that night with the window cracked for the sound of the lake, and even the frogs sounded like they'd agreed to keep it down. In the morning, the Discovery producer called with a small dollar figure for site stabilization support. "Conditions stand," I said. "Blur the lake, no drones, no publishing without consent from the tribal office, nothing that shows a route. If you want a moment, the only moment that matters is the one where someone decides not to touch something." "Noted," she said, and whether the network liked my editorial notes wasn't my problem. Kara smiled when I told her. "Sometimes the only way to teach restraint is to film it," she said. Old loyalties arrived in quieter ways. The guy from the bait shop drove out with a bundle of cedar stakes for free and said, "Your dad once fixed my outboard and wouldn't take a dime." The librarian in town set aside 3 books on land trusts and left them at the desk with a note in neat blue script. No due date. The bank teller who'd set up my stewardship account waved me over and showed me a jar filled with 1s and 5s labeled String Fund as a joke that wasn't entirely a joke. When I protested, she said, "You didn't ask for a Go Fund anything. This is people buying themselves into a story they can tell their kids about behaving." Not all loyalties cut in my direction. A developer's letter arrived with polished language and a number big enough to make a person's palms sweat. The conditions were frank. Purchase of the land contingent on rescinding the protective covenant. Cooperation in seeking a permit for site evaluation with private contractor. Non-disclosure of terms. I didn't carry it into the kitchen. I put it in the log as a line item. Offer received, declined, and then I shredded it because some paper burns better if you don't set a match to it. Paige texted an hour later, "You are making us look like fools." My thumbs hovered over and then wrote, "You're making yourself look like someone who doesn't read signs." She didn't reply. The week sharpened into a routine that felt like a new spine. Mornings with tape and flags and waddles, afternoons of forms and calls and small, precise victories, evenings with stew and biscuits and the low hum of fatigue that isn't the same as defeat. On Friday at 10, the representative returned with another colleague. We stood in a semicircle and listened. They said the word ceremony, and I said, "Yes, of course, we'll wait," and the waiting felt like action, not absence. By sunset, the yard wore a new order. Not just strings and flags now, but a chain at the gate, laminated notices, a covenant framed on the mantel and filed at the clerk's office, a line painted down the shared drive like grammar. The grid had grown, and so had the circle of people who understood the difference between curiosity and care. When the last truck pulled out and the evening's cooler air lifted the hair on my arms, I walked to the stabilized bank and stood very still. Somewhere beneath my boots and the cloth and the sand was the shard that had changed my math. The root ball's ragged edge looked like a wound and a map. I set my palm on the safe cloth and didn't push. The restraint felt like a kind of touch. "You all right?" Nora asked, coming up beside me with 2 mugs that smelled like lemon balm. "I knew it would be hard," I said. "I didn't know it would also feel like relief." "We're not alone in it," she said. "That helps. I thought of the judge's small sentence, the clerk's stamp, the stake of cedar, the bait shop guy's memory, the librarian's blue pen, the way the tribal representative looked at the water first. I thought of the backhoe operator idling, and the moment he chose to set his machine back from the flags. I thought of the camera that filmed nothing more flashy than the hand that stops short of touching, and will someday play that footage for people who need to see how restraint looks. I used to think power was the person with the biggest machine or the loudest lawyers, I said. Turns out it might be paper and patience and a gate chain set at the right angle. And a good biscuit, Nora said, because she is who she is. We stood until a loon stitched one clean note into the surface of the lake, and the pines answered with their soft hand clap. The world contracted to the sound of water against roots and the small chime of the trail camera when a raccoon sauntered by like an understudy who wanted a part. Tomorrow there'd be another letter to read, another call to return, another chance for someone to misunderstand on purpose and need correction, gently and with documentation. Tomorrow, we might reach the edge of the postline and find it bending in a way that made the map in Kara's notebook look like a necklace from a different angle. Tomorrow, someone might offer a larger number and an uglier condition. Tomorrow, someone might show up with a shovel and a story they told themselves about entitlement and find a chain and a sign and a community that had agreed to say no. Tonight, the bank held. The wattles hugged the slope. The cloth breathed. The covenant on the mantel caught the last light like a modest trophy. I wrote one more line in the log. Order posted, covenant recorded, visit complete, no disturbance, and signed it with a hand that felt steadier than the one that had first opened Dad's letter. We were past the pressure ridge now where water, weight, and rock make new shapes out of the old. We hadn't broken. We just learned how to hold. The first scrape of a trowel on soil sounds like a match being struck. We began at dawn, breath hanging in a thin thread over the grid, the lake holding the pink of a sky not yet decided about weather. We had permission, ceremony, and a plan that moved like a slow song. The representatives from the tribal office stood with us, eyes on the strings, and spoke words that did not ask the ground for anything it didn't want to give. Kara answered with the language of patience. I signed the form that named the day's intent. 2 1-meter test units, no deeper than 30 centimeters unless all parties agreed. No removal without consensus. Document first, touch last. Ready? Kara asked. And it wasn't a question about equipment. Ready, I said. My voice behaved. Unit 1 went in near the arc of the ditch, where the radar hinted at a story folded into the slope. Unit 2 sat at the edge of the rectangle that read like a room. We laid out plastic sheeting for the sod, set the sifting screens, checked the log sheets, checked again. When the first trowel passed, everyone went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when a child finally falls asleep. I didn't touch soil. I held the clipboard. Measurements, time, descriptions, and small neat print I'd practiced like calligraphy. Depth, 5 centimeters. Soil, brown loam with fine sand. Artifacts, none visible. We brushed, we photographed, we drew, we wrote. The first find at 9:22 wasn't gold or drama. It was a line. A shadow of darker soil cut the square like an old seam, straight enough to be human work, thin as the spine of a small book. Aaliyah called it gently, feature, and we all bent without stepping, as if the word itself had gravity. Post-mold likely, Kara said, her voice professional and a little breathless. We'll bisect later. For now, we map. We mapped. We measured the stain's edges with a tape that ticked softly against the string, placed nails at corners the way you pin a quilt. At 11:07, Unit 2 gave us something with a little more voice, a pocket of charcoal flecks and a faint reddening of soil as if fire had once licked it. Not a bonfire, a hearth maybe, or the memory of one. Record, Kara said quietly. Pause at 30 centimeters. We paused at exactly 30. the kind of obedience that would make a judge proud, and covered both units with breathable cloth. The ground exhaled under the fabric as if grateful for the pause. I was pouring coffee on the porch when a courier car rolled up, door stenciled with a name I'd only ever seen on envelopes. The driver jogged up the steps and handed me a thick packet with my name on the tab. Order to show cause. Emergency hearing this afternoon. Motion to dissolve protective covenant. Motion to compel the removal of interfering signage. Motion to restrain further encumbrances without the trust's consent. "They're throwing the kitchen sink," Nora said, scanning quickly. She pointed at a line halfway down a page and snorted. They cited a case about a carport. "I don't even have a garage," I said, and the laugh that came out of me tasted like metal. Kara met my eyes over the packet. "We can hold the squares," she said. "You go." "I want to be here when—" I started, and then I saw the truth in her face and the weight in the representative's stillness. "I'll be back by 4, I said. "Cover if it rains. Photograph everything. If you find anything that needs all hands, you text me and I'll turn around in the courthouse hall." Nora pressed a biscuit into my palm as if it were a legal document. "For strength," she said. The courthouse air was cool enough to steady a pulse. The clerk from last time recognized me and slid the schedule under the glass with a little nod that felt like a private blessing. The hearing room had more people in it. Reporters, a few locals I knew from the bait shop and the library, a man in a suit with a lapel pin that announced nothing I recognized. Paige sat 2 rows up with Mr. Holcomb and a second lawyer who looked like the kind of man who never forgot a comma. She didn't look back. When our case was called, Holcomb stood and said the word waste as if it tasted noble. He talked about clouds on title and good faith purchasers and made the covenant sound like a crime. The new lawyer, Watson, leaned into the microphone with a tone that suggested boredom with everyone else's slowness. "My clients are not opposed to cultural study," he said smoothly, "but the current measures are excessive. The signage is chilling, the covenant overbroad, and the media circus," he glanced meaningfully at the row of cameras, "suggests this is less about heritage than publicity." My lawyer's chair was empty because I didn't have one with a retainer, but I had people. SHC counsel spoke first, a woman with a voice like a bell in fog. She reminded the court that the commission had recommended temporary protection, that no subsurface disturbance had occurred without consent, that the covenant restricted only what the law already frowned on without due process. "We are here because the landowner has chosen restraint," she said. "We are defending her right to keep choosing it." Then the representative from the tribal office stood, time in their shoulders. "We have observed the site," they said, every word placed like a stone. "We have recommended care. The community will be harmed by haste. We ask that this court not compel a speed that erases what belongs to more than one name." When it was my turn, I kept it simple. "I invited the state," I said. "I posted the property. I recorded a covenant. I am following the plan we all agreed to today. No dirt has left the site. No coordinates have left the property. We're reading, not digging." Watson smirked. "Is it true a television network is filming?" he asked. "Do you deny that you're, in effect, turning this into a show?" I looked directly at him and at the judge. "They asked." I said they could film only restraint. No drones, no coordinates, no publishing without the tribal office's consent. If a camera teaches one person not to touch a thing they shouldn't, I'm willing to have my bad side on the news. Somebody in the back bait shop guy snorted and then coughed to make the sound legal. Before Holcomb could pivot to something that sounded like Latin, my phone buzzed in my bag with the vibration pattern I'd set for Kara. I didn't pull it out because court, but the hum twitched my ribs. SHC counsel saw the way my eyes flinched and asked the judge for a brief to confer. He waved us aside as he read the filings. In the hallway, the message bloomed. Unit 2, 28 to 32 centimeters. slate gorget W pars incised water spiral motif, copper beads, X2s, charred wood in situ for dating, all covered in place. Photos for record only. THPO requests you return when free. My mouth went dry. A gorget. Not an arrowhead to decorate a shelf. A voice piece, a signifier. Copper beads too. Trade, craft, time. I felt my father's neat script lift inside me like a tide. I walked back in with a steadiness I didn't have when I left. The judge looked up as we took places. "I've read your covenant," he said. "It is not overbroad. It recognizes competing interests. It preserves access to the structure and restricts disturbance to the land consistent with state recommendations. Ms. Parker," he glanced at my sister, "you do not get to compel removal of postings that inform the public of a site under review. I find no waste here. I find prudence." He wrote so matter-of-factly the pen sounded like rain. Motion to dissolve denied. Motion to restrain the landowner denied. Motions regarding signage denied. I will, however, clarify. No excavation beyond today's agreed parameters without SHC and tribal consent on written notice to the trust. I expect civility on both sides. Counsel, save the carport cases for carports. Holcomb winced and bowed his head in the ritual that meant he'd lost without admitting he had. In the hall afterward, Paige moved through the cluster like a knife through fabric. "You think a trinket under 30 centimeters makes you a saint," she said under her breath. "It makes you a pawn." "It makes the site eligible," I said, not bothering to soften the words. "It moves us from maybe to yes. It changes the math. You could help, or you could keep tripping over your own shoes." "You always did love people who tell you what to do," she said. "Dad, that woman with the ledger, now the state." "I like people who write things down and keep their hands clean," I said, and for once the line didn't shake. She opened her mouth, shut it, and settled for a smile that didn't reach any part of her face. "Enjoy your 15 minutes, she said. "We'll see how long your patience pays the light bill." "Longer than a sale that blows up in the paper," I said. "And I have a string fund." She blinked, annoyed she didn't know what that meant, and walked away fast enough for her heels to echo. I was back at the property before 2, heart beating hard for reasons a blood pressure cuff would understand, and reasons it wouldn't. The grid looked the same, which is to say perfect. The unit squares breathed under cloth. The representatives nodded me to Unit 2 like ushers at a quiet wedding. Kara lifted the edge of the fabric. The gorget lay half in the floor of the unit, half in the profile, slate dark against the lighter soil, 2 incised curves carving the suggestion of a river against stone. The copper beads, 2 at least, rested in the soil beside a faint striation of charcoal. Nothing had been plucked. Everything was drawn, measured, reverenced. "Photographed, mapped, left," Kara said. "We'll decide removal together, if at all. There's benefit to leaving it in situ for now." I crouched as close as the rules let me and felt an ache the size of a word I didn't have yet. It wasn't possession. It wasn't pride. It was like recognizing a familiar face in a crowd full of strangers and not knowing why you recognized them until they said your name. "Thank you," I said to the ground and to the people who had asked permission from it. We covered again. We did not take anything else. We recorded the charred woods location for potential dating later. The representative spoke quietly with Kara about a ceremonial day if removal became necessary. I wrote it all in the log. Careful block letters. Unit 2, gorget, copper beads, charcoal, in place, covered, no removal. At 3, the news vans returned, drawn by whatever scent reporters follow when court and dirt share a day. Jenna approached slower than before, eyes on the strings, mouth a little less determined to smile. "We heard," she said, not naming what she'd heard. "Anything you can share?" "Only this," I said. "We found evidence that this place is what we thought it was, and more. We're not publishing images or details. We're in the long part of the story now. She nodded as if she'd finally been invited to a party that required a dress she didn't own. "Can we film you, covering it back up?" she asked, and the question held the right shape. "You can film a hand not touching," I said. "You can film a cloth going down. You can film a pen in a log." That's the footage they took. The angle of fabric returning to soil, Kara's pencil ticking in a notebook, my palm hovering above the square and stopping. Later, maybe, some people would mock it as boring. I hoped a few would feel their own hand pause. At 4, the county clerk's office emailed me an update. With SHC's letter and the court's order, the site qualified for expedited listing on the State Register of Historic Places. It wasn't a fortress. It was, however, a thicker door with a better lock. I printed the email and slid it into the Land tab behind the covenant. Paper again, the quiet power that had saved us twice that week. We didn't celebrate with champagne. We ate stew with more bread than we needed and let our bodies remember we were made of meat and patience. After dishes, Nora and I walked the line down the shared drive, white paint still bright, and stood at the gate while mosquitoes reconsidered their evening plans. "You okay?" she asked. "I thought victory would feel louder," I said. "It feels like grammar. Like we put the comma in the right place and the sentence finally means what it's supposed to." "Punctuation saves lives," she said, deadpan, "and sometimes land." Under the porch light, I drafted one email I didn't expect to send. Page. "Today the court kept the covenant. We found material that strengthens protection. The site is moving toward the state register. I'm establishing a foundation to steward it. There will be a seat for a representative from the trust if you want to be part of something worth more than a sale. It comes with work. M." I stared at the cursor a long time and pressed send. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a ladder laid against a wall. Whether she climbed was not on me. Later, I took Dad's journal out and opened to a page where he'd drawn a spiral and written, "River Remembers." I slid a scrap of paper in as a bookmark and wrote the day's facts on it like a child reporting to a parent. Judge said no to haste. Slate with water curve, copper. We didn't touch. The house smelled like lemon balm and wet cotton. The trail camera blinked once when a fox trotted the edge of the field like someone late for an appointment. Before sleep, I stepped out onto the porch. The grid was a suggestion in the dark. Strings like soft spider silk, flags black against darker black. Across the lake, a loon stitched one quiet note into the night. For the first time since the will, I didn't brace for a blow as I listened to silence. A different kind of waiting lived here now. Tomorrow the units would open again. Tomorrow we would decide together whether the gorget came out or stayed. Tomorrow, SHC would send the register form, and I'd answer questions that made this feel less like a fight and more like filing, which in this country is the closest thing to a prayer a clerk can hear. Tomorrow, maybe, Paige would answer my email, and maybe she wouldn't. What we'd changed today didn't depend on her reply. The ground had spoken in slate and copper and carbon. The court had answered in sentences. The cameras had learned how to film restraint. The town had decided a jar labeled String Fund was a reasonable thing to keep by the register. The tribe had stood on my porch and said thank you for waiting, and I had meant the thing I said back. Not yours, not mine. Ours, if we behave. The chain at the gate clicked when I tugged it, angled just so. It sounded less like a barrier tonight and more like a metronome, keeping time for a song I finally knew how to sing without hurrying. 6 weeks later, the grid looked less like a battlefield and more like a garden someone loved. The strings sagged a little in afternoon heat, flags faded to polite pinks and oranges, wattles settled into the bank the way stitches settle into skin. The lake wore October on its shoulders, cool light, clear air, geese stitching their own signatures into the sky. I could tell time now by the way the pines let go of light at 4. We had not taken the gorget out. That was the first decision we'd made together the week after court, under a sky so clean it felt newly washed. Kara had laid out the options. document and lift or document and leave, and the representatives from the tribal office listened, then spoke. "It has a job here," one said, hand open over the square, not touching. "It is still doing it." We brought in a scanner and made a three-dimensional image so thorough you could count the faint tool marks in the slate. Then we eased the breathable fabric back into place and tucked it the way you tuck a blanket around a sleeping child. The camera crew filmed the tuck and nothing else. When the producer asked, quietly, if we could just peel the cloth back for one quick beauty shot, I shook my head and said, "The beauty is the cloth." The piece that aired a week later surprised me. It did not star me. It did not even star the ground. It starred all the times someone stopped a hand an inch short of the thing they wanted and wrote it down instead. They blurred the lake so thoroughly, our own trees looked like dream pines. Jenna's stand-up was short and almost reverent. At Lakeshore Road, restraint is the story. My phone buzzed with texts from numbers. I didn't know that said things like, "Thank you," and "How can we help," and "Can we send string?" The bait shop jar filled twice and someone replaced it with a coffee can with a lid and a slit and a handwritten label that said stewardship, because apparently we'd graduated from twine. We held a small ceremony, not a spectacle, a circle. The representatives stood at the edge of the grid and the rest of us stood behind the strings, and the lake breathed and nobody gave a speech. There were words, but they didn't ask to be made public. When it was over, we walked back to the porch the long way around so the square could be alone with what it was. I sent the register forms off in a fat envelope with tabs, copies of copies, our polite notices, the judge's sentence, site maps, the log. The clerk at the post office stamped the corner with a thunk that sounded final, and then, because it was our clerk, said, "String Fund got a cousin." She held up a second jar a kid had left with the words, "Field Lunch" written in Sharpie and a drawing of a biscuit. "He said he likes history, but he likes biscuits more." "Same," I said. Some things landed like they'd been launched from far away. The emergency protective order the county had posted at the drive matured into an ordinance that mentioned the site without naming it, a line or two that made what we were doing a little sturdier for the next set of people who needed paper to do the job of a fence. A professor I'd never met wrote to offer a training for local teachers about how to teach archaeology like ethics instead of like treasure hunting. The library put my log on display for a day so kids could see what a day of restraint looked like in block letters. They returned it with a sticky note that said, "We didn't touch anything." I founded a foundation, which is a sentence that still made me laugh out loud if I said it without coffee. It wasn't fancy. It had a name, Lakeshore Foundation, and a bank account that started with a number so small I felt sheepish handing the teller the deposit. The bylaws used words that made my head itch: fiduciary, indemnify. But between the legalese there were sentences that felt like our porch: a board seat for a representative from the tribal office, a board seat for SHC ex officio, one for whoever held the house in trust, one for a teacher, one for a neighbor who remembered stories no one wrote down. I asked Nora to be treasurer because the world loves a ledger, and she loves a pencil sharpened enough to think. Paige did not answer my email about a seat at the table. Not at first. She kept sending letters through Holcomb and Watson, polished as river stones, that suggested I was enjoying my power too much. "This is not about enjoyment," I wrote back once. "It is about humility with a paper trail." Then I stopped answering every volley because not every ball deserved a return. The call that changed something came on a Tuesday, so ordinary it barely bothered to be a day. The number that flashed on my phone was Paige's, not her lawyer's. I let it ring one extra time so I wouldn't sound breathless. "I read the bylaws," she said without preamble. "Hello to you too," I said, and she exhaled a laugh that sounded like it surprised her by showing up. "I don't want a seat," she said. "I don't want to sit in meetings with people who like clipboards. But..." The pause stretched and held. I don't want to be the villain in a story people tell at the diner. You don't have to be anything you don't choose, I said. The sentence had taken me most of my adult life to learn how to mean. She cleared her throat. Holcomb thinks we can get the house listed if we carve the covenants into the deed. No disturbance, no digging, access easement across the land, same as your corridor, disclosure to buyers that plates and hearts matter more than patios. It'll shave the number. It should shave the number, I said. And there it was. Not a win, not a loss. Just a math problem solved with context. Will you? She stopped. If I sign, will you stop fighting me? I sat down without telling my knees I planned to. Paige, I'm not fighting you, I said quietly. I'm holding lines. You keep running into them because you're in a hurry. It's hard not to be, she said, and for a heartbeat, I heard the part of her I had missed beneath the armor, the girl who learned to get her own homework done while Dad forgot about school lunch forms, the woman who found a lever that worked, money, and used it on everything because you use the tools you have. I know, I said. It's hard not to be. She arrived 2 afternoons later with a folder and a face not dressed for cameras. Nora poured coffee and set out a plate without comment. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table like a family that knew better than to call itself that too early. Paige slid the papers across to me. Draft deed restrictions, disclosure forms, the language that would let the trust sell the structure while leaving my dirt under my care. Holcomb says this is as protective as he's ever seen a deed be, without turning into a sermon, she said. Watson is bored, which is his way of saying he didn't find a hole. We read aloud, line by line, which is something I recommend even to people who do not have sisters. Then we initialed. Then we signed. Then we called the clerk and learned which counter to visit with which forms and which pens. It took 90 minutes of polite bureaucracy and a $20 recording fee to stop being enemies. There are wars that lasted longer, and we let those ghosts have the honor they're due by doing this quietly. At the end, she stood with the copy in her hand and looked at the mantel where I'd framed the covenant. The judge's order. A photo of Dad with his laugh knocking the corners off his face. Her eyes landed on the envelope I'd set there the day of the will, hers, still sealed, because I had not been the one to deliver it. I had left it for her to pick up when and if she wanted to. She reached. Her hands didn't shake. She slid a nail under the flap, broke the seal, read. I watched her mouth do what mine had done weeks earlier, flatten, tremble. Find the set point between those 2 arrangements. She folded the letter back into the envelope and put it on the mantel again, beside the covenant, as if those 2 papers belonged to the same species of truth. I'll send you the listing to look at before it goes live, she said. No drones, no road. Blur the lake. Who taught you that? I asked, and she rolled her eyes and grinned and pointed 2 fingers at me. When she left, she hugged Nora. She did not hug me. We had not earned that yet. We had earned an easement and silence that didn't feel like a weapon. It was enough. The register came through the week before the first hard frost. SHC called, voice warm. You're official, Kara said. I whispered thank you to the quiet kitchen and then laughed at myself for whispering to a room that knew my loud voice well by now. We taped the letter the way we had taped the order. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that paper held when muscle got tired. I started sleeping at the lake 3 nights a week, not as a squatter in a house that wasn't mine, but as a steward in a place that was. Nora and I developed a choreography you could write down and call manners. I brought groceries and gas for the generator and learned how her coffee likes to be measured. She fixed a door and taught me how to sharpen a trowel without turning it into a weapon. We watched the grid together at dusk like some people watch television. We ate the stew that had no recipe, but always tasted the same. We walked the white line down the drive at night with a flashlight, not to check on the chain so much as to let it hear we were awake. On the last warm day before the leaves let go for real, I drove into town and turned in the keys to my apartment. I'd been halfway gone for weeks. The place a cupboard of duplicates, a second skillet, a spare toothbrush, a calendar that stopped on the day of the hearing because afterward the numbers had rearranged themselves. The landlord did a walkthrough with me and said, "You found your place," like it was a status and not a location. "I found my job," I said. Place came with it. I took one more drive past Willow Drive out of superstition or habit. I don't know. A simple for sale sign stood in the yard. Not large, not shouting. The listing online used the phrases we had insisted on. House conveys with deed restrictions protecting cultural site on adjacent land. No subsurface disturbance. Access easement by agreement. There were photos of sun, a porch swing that needed paint, a kitchen that would look nicer if someone cooked in it with flour and patience. I did not feel loss or victory. I felt like someone had finally labeled a jar correctly. Back at the lake, I built a bench. It wasn't complicated carpentry. 2 cedar rounds, a plank planed smooth, screws tight enough to hold without splitting. I set it at the edge of the grid, but not inside it, where you could sit and see the strings and the water and the line of the porch in the same frame. Nora brought out 2 old cushions because she does not believe in suffering when softness can be arranged, and we sat. "Right today?" she asked. I opened the site log. Day. 42. Register letter arrived. Deed restrictions recorded. Listing live with covenant. Unit 2 remains covered. Leaves flagged. Wattles holding. No disturbance. I signed with a hand that had learned the shape of its own name again. Then I took out Dad's journal and the scanner print of the gorget and the copper beads and laid them on my lap. His last page still breathed. You don't own the past, he'd written. You share it. He had not told me how to share it without getting tired. He'd probably been tired when he wrote it, but he had written it anyway. "Want to read it out loud?" Nora asked. I did. The words had changed since the first time. Not because the ink had, but because the life around the ink had. We reached the line about the site paying me back, finder's fee, easement, and I folded in a different spot than I had months ago. It already has, I said. Not for the money, but for the grammar of my days. In the weeks that followed, we took the strings up a little at a time to give winter room without losing the lines entirely. We rolled them around pieces of cardboard and labeled the rolls like they were holiday lights. Southeast rectangle, ditch arc north. The grid went into hibernation with the same care we'd given it awake. We left the cloth over the squares, pinned at the corners like quilts. On the day the first skim of ice took the cove and turned the reeds into glass drinking straws, I walked the drive alone and then not alone because the backhoe operator from that first morning rolled up in his pickup with a bundle of cedar stakes again. Leftovers, he said, from a job that didn't deserve them. "Thank you," I said, and he kicked a clump of frozen mud off his bumper and pretended he didn't want a biscuit. I texted Paige a picture of the register letter with the part showing where the site's name would have been if it had one. She replied with a thumbs up, and an hour later, a separate message that said, "I took the porch swing down. I'll paint it this winter." "Good," I wrote. "Spring needs someplace to sit." I did not ask her to come to the next ceremony. She didn't ask if she could. We let our peace be measured in forms and the absence of emergency calls. Sometimes that is the correct size of a truce. On the last evening before heavy snow, the 3 of us, me, Nora, Kara, stood at the gate and looked back. The chain hung at its angle. Not a threat, just a reminder. The laminated notices had clouded at the corners. The covenant on the mantel inside had a faint dent where someone had leaned a thumb too long reading. The bench held the outline of our bodies from autumn afternoons. The lake took the last light reluctantly and then agreed to let go. "You all right?" Nora asked, because that was how she loved people, by not assuming. "I am," I said, and felt the truth of it land all the way down. I thought the win would be the court. Then I thought the win would be the slate. Turns out the win is the boring things we do every day without anybody clapping. "Welcome to stewardship," Kara said, and we laughed, the gentle kind that makes cold air smoke. We locked the gate. The click sounded like a period, not an ending, just the kind that makes the next sentence clear. On the porch, we left the light on for a minute and then turned it off. The house exhaled. The lake did its slow winter breathing. A loon had already gone south, but a fox cut the edge of the yard like a comma, soft-footed, sentence not over yet. I tucked the log under my arm like a book worth finishing and slid Dad's journal back into its box. And then, because I am not foolish about rats, into a plastic tub with a lid that girths with a satisfying snap. We walked to the truck. The road out held a skin of frost that made the world look like a thing someone had taken the trouble to sugar. In the rear view, the porch hid itself among the pines. The grid slept. We drove slow so the day could finish itself without us rushing it. I did not know who would buy the house or what color they would prefer for walls or if they would be good at replacing screens. I knew what they would not be allowed to do. I knew where they would be invited to help. I knew there would be a seat at a table and a sign on a shelf and a jar at a counter, and a kid who drew a biscuit and a teacher who knew, because of a piece of paper and a camera and a circle, that digging is not the only way to find something. When we hit the blacktop, I checked the lock on my memory the way I checked the chain. It held. The story would not get away from me if I told it carefully. Not yours, not mine, ours, if we behave. The metronome of the chain, small in my head, kept time. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.